The night Henry Clayborne called his wife into the study, Lydia knew something had broken inside him. She had seen it building for months. The way he avoided her eyes at dinner, the sudden silences when guests mentioned children, the locked door to his office, where he spent hours with ledgers and whiskey. But nothing prepared her for what he said that October evening, his voice steady and cold as iron. "You will lie with Nathan. You will bear me a son, and you will bear me a son, and you will never speak of this to anyone." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Lydia's hands went numb. Her vision blurred. For a moment she thought she had misheard him, that the fever she'd been fighting had finally claimed her mind. But Henry's face showed no madness, no hesitation, only the terrible resolve of a man who had made a calculation and found it acceptable. Outside, the Mississippi night pressed against the windows of the Clayborne plantation house. 200 acres of cotton stretched toward the river, worked by 53 enslaved people whose names Henry barely knew. Inside, the heir to one of the state's oldest fortunes had just given an order that would destroy 3 lives and expose secrets that reached back further than anyone could have imagined. This is not a story about forbidden love. This is a story about power, desperation, and the moment when the machinery of slavery turned inward and consumed its own architects. Before we continue with this shocking story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment which city you're listening from. Let's strengthen our community so no one forgets these stories. Thank you, and let's continue. Henry Clayborne learned he could not father children in the winter of 1856, though he never spoke the words aloud. Dr. Morrison made the visit to Clayborne House on a Tuesday afternoon, arriving without his usual medical bag, which told Henry everything before the conversation began. They sat in the study with the door closed for 37 minutes. When the doctor left, Henry remained at his desk until the lamp burned out, staring at the portrait of his father that dominated the wall above the fireplace. Thomas Clayborne had built the family fortune on tobacco in Virginia before the soil gave out. He moved the operation to Mississippi in 1834, switching to cotton and bringing 19 enslaved people with him. By the time he died in 1848, the Clayborne holdings had tripled. The family name appeared in newspapers from New Orleans to Richmond. Thomas had expected his son to expand the legacy, to fill the house with children who would carry the Clayborne blood into the next century. Henry was 42 years old. He had been married to Lydia for 7 years. The nursery on the second floor remained empty, its door kept closed by unspoken agreement. In the beginning, Henry blamed his wife. He sent her to doctors in Jackson and Memphis. They examined her, prescribed tonics made of iron and herbs, suggested she pray more fervently. Nothing changed. The doctors never examined Henry. Southern gentlemen did not submit to such indignities. But Dr. Morrison had known the Clayborne family for 3 decades. He had delivered Henry into the world, had seen him through childhood fevers and broken bones. When Henry finally asked the question directly, asked why 7 years had produced nothing, Morrison had no choice but to tell the truth. The problem was not Lydia. It had never been Lydia. Henry never told his wife what the doctor said. Instead, he withdrew. He spent more time in the fields, driving the overseers harder, demanding higher yields from land already pushed to exhaustion. He attended fewer social functions. When forced to appear at gatherings of the county's plantation families, he drank more than was proper and left early. People began to talk. The whispers started gently. Concern about his health, speculation about financial troubles. Then the questions grew sharper. Why no children after 7 years? What was wrong with the Clayborne line? In Mississippi in 1858, a man's worth was measured in land, cotton, and sons. Henry had the first 2, but without the third, everything felt temporary, borrowed, built on sand. He watched other men his age with children climbing on their knees, and something twisted inside him. The shame became physical, a weight that pressed on his chest when he woke and followed him through each day. Lydia felt the change but couldn't name it. Her husband had never been warm. Their marriage was an arrangement between families, not a romance. But he had been present, beautiful, even kind in his distant way. After Morrison's visit, Henry became a ghost in his own house. He took his meals in the study. He slept in a separate room, claiming his cough would disturb her. When they did speak, his words were clipped, functional, drained of anything resembling tenderness. She tried to reach him. She asked if he was ill, if the plantation was in trouble, if she had done something to offend him. He waved away her questions with increasing irritation. Once when she pressed too hard, he told her she was imagining things, that women were prone to hysteria, and she should occupy herself with household matters and leave him to his business. The cruelty in his voice shocked her into silence. Lydia came from a different world than Henry. Her father had been a Presbyterian minister in a small Alabama town, a man who owned 3 books and believed wealth was a spiritual danger. When Henry's family proposed the marriage, Lydia's parents saw it as providence. Their daughter would never know poverty, never struggle as they had. They did not consider whether she would be happy. Happiness was not a priority for people of their station. She entered the marriage at 21, terrified and hopeful in equal measure. The Clayborne house overwhelmed her. 12 rooms, crystal chandeliers, furniture shipped from France. Enslaved people who served her meals and dressed her hair confused and disturbed her. Her father had preached against slavery, though carefully aware that such views could make a minister unemployable in the South. Lydia had grown up understanding slavery as a moral wrong, but also as an established fact of the world she inhabited, something too large and entrenched to resist. At Clayborne House, she learned to navigate the system. She tried to be kind to the house servants, to learn their names, to avoid the casual cruelty she saw other plantation wives inflict. But kindness within slavery was still slavery. She knew this. The knowledge sat in her stomach like a stone she could never digest. For the first few years of marriage, she focused on her duties as a wife. She managed the household, oversaw the domestic staff, hosted dinners for Henry's business associates. She learned which topics of conversation pleased him and which ones earned his disapproval. She submitted to his physical demands without complaint, though he approached intimacy with the same efficiency he brought to reviewing cotton accounts. She told herself this was normal, that marriage was meant to be a partnership of function rather than feeling. But the absence of children aided both of them in different ways. For Henry, it was public failure, visible weakness. For Lydia, it was a different kind of emptiness. She had expected to be a mother, had prepared for it, imagined it, structured her understanding of her future around it. When month after month produced nothing, she began to wonder if God was punishing her for some sin she could not identify. The doctors told her the fault was hers. She believed them because who was she to question learned men? The house grew quieter. The silences between husband and wife stretched longer. By 1857, they were living parallel lives that intersected only at required moments. Sunday church, occasional dinners, social obligations that demanded they appear together. The servants noticed. The enslaved people who worked in the house noticed everything, though they were careful to show nothing. They saw the master's anger, the mistress's sadness, the way the house itself seemed to hold its breath. In the quarters beyond the main house, 53 people lived in structures that could barely be called buildings. They worked from dawn until dark, 6 days a week, their bodies exploited to produce the wealth that supported the Clayborne lifestyle. Among them was a young man named Nathan, 26 years old, born on the plantation to parents who had been sold away when he was 12. Nathan worked in the fields during planting and harvest seasons, but his real value to the Clayborne operation came from his skill with carpentry and blacksmithing. He could repair equipment, build structures, solve mechanical problems that baffled others. This made him valuable, which meant he received slightly better food, slightly less brutal treatment than some others. He understood that his skills were the only thing keeping him alive. At the moment he stopped being useful, he would become disposable. He was a quiet man, careful with his words, always watching. The other enslaved people respected him. When someone needed help, Nathan provided it without asking for anything in return. When younger people despaired, he found ways to offer hope without making promises no one could keep. He had seen too many people broken by false hope, had learned that survival required a delicate balance between resistance and accommodation. Nathan had been whipped 3 times in his life. The first was at 14 for being too slow in the fields. The second was at 19 for looking an overseer in the eye during a confrontation. The third was at 23 for reasons he never understood. The overseer had been drunk and angry, and Nathan was simply available. Each time he bore the pain without crying out, knowing that any sound would only extend the punishment. Each time he recovered and returned to work, his face revealing nothing of what he felt inside. He did not hate Henry Clayborne personally. Hatred required a level of emotional engagement Nathan could not afford. The master was simply a fact of existence. Like weather or hunger, you endured him, you survived him. You waited for something to change, though you never spoke of what that change might be. In September of 1858, Nathan noticed the master watching him. It happened several times over the course of a week. Henry standing at the edge of the work site, staring with an intensity that made Nathan's skin crawl. The overseer noticed too, and began pushing Nathan harder, assuming the master's attention meant Nathan had done something wrong. But Nathan had been careful, had done his work exactly as required. He could not understand what had changed. On September 28, the overseer called Nathan to the barn and told him the master wanted to see him at the house after supper. Nathan's stomach dropped. Enslaved people were never summoned to the main house unless something bad was about to happen. He considered running, but where would he go? The patrols would find him within a day, and the punishment for attempted escape was either death or sale to the deep South plantations, where life expectancy was measured in years rather than decades. So he went. He walked to the back entrance of the main house as the sun set, his hands shaking despite his efforts at control. A house servant he barely knew opened the door and led him through corridors he had never seen, past furniture worth more than the lives of everyone in the quarters combined. They stopped outside a closed door. The servant knocked, announced Nathan's presence, then disappeared, leaving him alone. Enter. Henry's voice came from inside. Nathan opened the door. The study was all dark wood and leather, shelves of books Nathan would never be allowed to read, a desk that gleamed with polish. Henry sat behind it, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his face expressionless. He did not tell Nathan to sit. Enslaved people did not sit in the presence of masters. "You are healthy," Henry said. It was not a question. "Strong. You have good teeth, clear eyes. You do your work without complaint." Nathan said nothing. There was no safe response. "I have decided on something," Henry continued. His voice was flat, mechanical, as if he were reading from a ledger. "You will perform a service for me. You will not refuse. You will never speak of it. If you do either of these things, I will have you hanged. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Nathan whispered, though he did not understand at all. Henry finished his whiskey. "You may go, but stay close to the house. You will be sent for soon." Nathan backed out of the room, his mind racing. He returned to the quarters with no idea what had just happened, only a terrible certainty that his life had just been redirected towards something he could not escape. 3 weeks later, on an October night when the air smelled like coming rain, Henry Clayborne called his wife into his study and spoke the words that would break everything open. Lydia stood in the study doorway, still wearing the dress she had put on that morning, her hands clasped in front of her the way she had been taught as a girl. Henry sat at his desk, backlit by the oil lamp, his face in shadow. He had not looked directly at her in 3 months, but tonight his eyes were focused, intense, burning with something she could not name. "Close the door," he said. She did, her movements careful and precise. Whatever was coming, she needed to be composed. She had learned this lesson well. Never show fear, never show weakness, never give him reason to question her obedience. Sit. She took the chair across from him, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. Somewhere in the house a clock ticked. Outside, cicadas sang their late season song. "I have made a decision about our situation," Henry began. His voice was steady, practiced as if he had rehearsed this speech. "You and I both know we have been unsuccessful in producing an heir. This failure threatens everything our family has built, our name, our legacy, our position in this county." Lydia's throat tightened. They had never spoken openly about the absence of children. The subject existed in the space between them, acknowledged but never named. Hearing him address it directly felt like a violation, as if he had ripped away the last protection they had against facing the truth. "I have consulted doctors," he continued. "I have explored every reasonable option. Nothing has worked, and so I am forced to consider an alternative solution, one that no man should have to contemplate, but which circumstances demand." He paused, took a breath. Lydia's hands were cold. She could feel her pulse in her ears. "You will conceive a child," Henry said. "The child will be raised as mine, as a Clayborne heir. No one will ever question its legitimacy. This family will continue. Our reputation will be preserved." Relief flooded through her for one confused second. He was suggesting adoption, perhaps, or some legal arrangement with a distant relative, but then she saw his expression, saw the hardness there, the absolute resolution, and she knew with sick certainty that whatever he was about to say would be worse than she could imagine. "You will lie with Nathan," Henry said, "the carpenter. He is healthy, strong, intelligent. You will serve this purpose. You will conceive a child through him. When you are pregnant, we will announce it as our own. The timing will be managed carefully. No one will suspect anything." The words made no sense at first. Lydia's mind refused to process them as if they were spoken in a foreign language. She stared at her husband, waiting for him to laugh, to tell her this was some terrible joke, some test of her loyalty. But his face remained serious, expectant, waiting for her response. "I don't understand," she whispered. "You understand perfectly well," Henry said sharply. "I am giving you an order. You will obey it. You're asking me to." She could not finish the sentence, could not force her mouth to form the words. "I am not asking," Henry said. I am telling you what will happen. Nathan has already been informed that he will perform a service for me. He knows disobedience means death. You should know the same. If you refuse, if you speak of this to anyone, I will divorce you and destroy your family's name so thoroughly that your father will lose his church. Your mother will be shunned. Your sisters will never marry. Do not test me on this, Lydia. I have considered every possibility, and this is the path we will take. She could not breathe. The room was spinning, the walls closing in. This is evil, she managed to say. What you're suggesting is necessary, Henry interrupted. Nothing more. You will set aside your moral dramatics and do what is required. You are my wife. Your body belongs to me by law and by God. I am simply directing its use in a way that serves our mutual interests. How can you? Her voice broke. How can you sit there and speak of God while commanding me to commit adultery, while forcing a man who has no choice into Nathan is not a man? Henry said coldly, he is property. You will not insult me by suggesting otherwise, and as for adultery, I am giving my permission. That removes the sin. You will conceive a child. We will raise it as ours, and this matter will be closed. Your duty is obedience, that is all. Lydia stood so abruptly that her chair fell backward. I will not do this. I will not. You have lost your mind. This as Henry was around the desk before she could finish, moving faster than she thought possible. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to bruise. His face was inches from hers, his breath hot and sharp with alcohol. You will do exactly as I say, he hissed, or I will make you wish you had. Do you think you have choices, Lydia? Do you think your comfort matters? You are here to serve one purpose, to provide me with an heir. If you cannot do that naturally, you will do it through whatever means I determine. This is not a negotiation. He released her so suddenly she stumbled. She caught herself against the desk, her breath coming in short gasps, her mind screaming for escape, but finding none. She was trapped. She had always been trapped from the moment her father agreed to this marriage. But she had never felt the bars of her cage so clearly. When she whispered, hating herself for the question, hating that she was already calculating survival rather than resistance. Tomorrow night, Henry said, returning to his chair as if nothing had happened. You will go to the small cabin at the edge of the orchard. Nathan will be waiting. You will do what needs to be done. You will continue to do so on whatever schedule is necessary until you are pregnant. Then we will resume our normal lives and never speak of this again. I cannot, Lydia said, but her voice had no strength left in it. You can and you will, Henry replied. Now go to your room, compose yourself. Tomorrow evening after supper you will leave the house quietly and do your duty. That is all. She turned toward the door, her legs unsteady, her vision blurred with tears. She refused to let fall in front of him. As she reached for the handle, Henry spoke again. Lydia. She stopped, but did not turn. This is for both of us, he said, and there was something almost gentle in his voice which made it worse somehow. You want children as much as I do? This way you will have one. We will be a family. No one needs to know how it came to be. This is mercy in its way. You should thank me. She opened the door and walked out without responding, moving through the house like a ghost, past servants who avoided her eyes, up the stairs to her bedroom, where she closed the door and stood in the darkness, her body shaking with something beyond fear or anger or grief, something that had no name because it lived in a place where words did not reach. In the quarters, Nathan sat on the edge of his sleeping platform, staring at nothing. The overseer had come an hour before sunset with new instructions. Tomorrow night, the cabin by the orchard, the master's wife would be there. Nathan was to do what was necessary. Refusal meant death. Questions meant death. Speaking of it meant death. Nathan had not asked what necessary meant. He already knew, the way the master had looked at him the past weeks, the way the overseer had leered when delivering the message. He understood what was being asked of him, what was being taken from him. He thought about running. The thought came and went like a ghost. Where would he run to? How far would he get? And even if he somehow made it to free territory, he would be abandoning everyone he knew, every person in these quarters who depended on the fragile stability of this hell they inhabited together. He thought about refusing, about standing in that cabin tomorrow night and saying, no, consequences be damned. But he knew what would happen. They would not just kill him. They would make an example of him. They would torture him in front of everyone, would break him slowly over days, would ensure that his death served as a warning to every other enslaved person on the property. And after they killed him, they would simply choose someone else. The master's plan would proceed, regardless. So Nathan sat in the darkness and understood that his choices had been removed the moment he was born into this system, that his body had never belonged to him, that this was simply another way of being used, another form of violation to add to the thousand small destructions that comprised his existence. He thought of his mother, sold away when he was 12 to pay one of the master's debts. He thought of his father, who had been beaten to death by an overseer when Nathan was 7. He thought of everyone he had known who had been broken, sold, killed, worked to death, their lives consumed to build the wealth of families like the Claybornes. And he thought of the woman who would walk into that cabin tomorrow night, terrified and ashamed, forced into this act by the same man who held Nathan's life in his hands. He felt no anger toward her. She was as trapped as he was, caught in a different cage, but still imprisoned. The next day passed in a fog. Lydia moved through her routine mechanically, responding when spoken to, performing her duties, all while her mind screamed. She considered every possible escape. She could refuse and accept the consequences Henry threatened, but she thought of her family, of her father, who had worked his entire life to maintain his small church, of her mother and sisters who depended on the fragile respectability that marriage to Henry had provided. Henry would destroy them. She knew this with certainty. His cruelty was not impulsive. It was calculated, thorough, absolute. She could run away, but where would she go with no money, no resources, no skills that would allow her to survive? Women who left their husbands became outcasts, unemployable, often forced into prostitution simply to eat, and Henry would find her. Men like him always did. She could kill herself. The thought arrived quietly, almost gently, like a solution rather than an ending. If she was dead, Henry's plan would fail and she would escape this nightmare. But suicide was a mortal sin, would bar her from heaven, would bring even more shame to her family, and some part of her, the part that had survived 27 years by bending but not breaking, refused to give Henry that victory. So when evening came, when supper was finished and the house staff began their closing rituals, Lydia found herself putting on a dark cloak and walking toward the back door. Henry had retired to his study. The servants were in the kitchen. No one saw her slip outside. The orchard was at the southern edge of the property, a small grove of apple trees planted by Henry's father in better days. A cabin stood at its edge, built originally as storage, but now empty, forgotten. A single lamp glowed inside, visible through the cracked door. Lydia's feet carried her forward, even as her mind rebelled. Each step felt like walking toward her own execution. Her hands were numb. Her breath came in short gasps. When she reached the door, she stood frozen, unable to force herself to enter. Inside, Nathan waited. He stood when he heard footsteps outside, his body tense, every muscle ready for flight, even though flight was impossible. When the door opened and Lydia entered, their eyes met for just a second before both looked away, unable to bear what they saw reflected there, two people about to be forced into an act neither wanted, both powerless to stop it, both hating the man who had created this moment. "I'm sorry," Lydia whispered. The words were inadequate, meaningless, but she had to say something. Nathan said nothing. There was nothing to say. They both knew what came next. They both understood that speaking would only make it worse. What happened in that cabin is not written here. It cannot be. The details belong to Lydia and Nathan alone, to the private horror they were forced to endure. What can be said is this. When Lydia returned to the house 2 hours later, something inside her had been destroyed that could never be repaired. When Nathan returned to the quarters before dawn, his face was blank, empty, as if he had removed some essential part of himself and hidden it away where even he could not find it. Henry asked no questions. He simply marked the date in a journal he kept locked in his desk. One entry among many, a business transaction recorded with the same efficiency he used to track cotton yields and equipment repairs. The command was repeated 5 more times over the next 6 weeks. Each time Lydia walked to the cabin, feeling something die a little more. Each time Nathan endured what could not be refused. Neither spoke during these encounters. Neither looked at the other afterward. They were both trying to survive, both using whatever psychological strategies they could to separate their minds from their bodies to exist somewhere else while their physical selves obeyed the master's order. On the 7th week, Lydia's monthly bleeding did not come. She waited 3 days hoping she was wrong, praying for some other explanation, but she knew her body told her with absolute certainty she was pregnant. She told Henry that evening. He smiled for the first time in months. "Good," he said. "You will not return to the cabin. Nathan will be reassigned to field work in the far sections. You will rest, eat well, and prepare to be a mother." "This is excellent news, Lydia. You have done your duty admirably." She stared at him, at this man who spoke of duty while orchestrating rape, who smiled while destroying lives, who believed his actions were justified because the result served his purposes. and for the first time since receiving his command, Lydia felt something other than fear or shame. She felt rage, cold and clear, settling into her bones like ice. "Yes, Henry," she said quietly, "I have done my duty." But even as she spoke the words of submission, something had changed. The woman who had walked into this marriage believing in obedience and acceptance was gone. In her place was someone harder, someone who had seen the true nature of the man she had married and understood that survival meant planning, patience, and a willingness to do what was necessary when the moment came. Henry saw none of this. He saw only a beautiful wife who had obeyed, a problem solved, a future secured. He announced the pregnancy to their social circle with appropriate pride. People congratulated him, praised Lydia's glowing health, made jokes about sleepless nights to come. The Clayborne family was secure. The legacy would continue. But in the house, in the spaces between the public performance, tensions were building that Henry could not see or control. Lydia had begun to notice things. The way the house servants moved with careful efficiency around Henry, never turning their backs, always watching. The way Nathan's absence from the regular work rotations was noticed and remarked upon by the other enslaved people. The way money seemed tighter than it should be. How Henry became agitated when bills arrived. How he spent increasing hours with his ledgers and correspondence. Something was wrong with the Clayborne finances. Lydia had no access to the books, no right to ask questions, but she was not stupid. She saw Henry's stress, saw how he started drinking earlier each day, saw how he snapped at the overseers with increasing frequency. The plantation was in trouble. The forced pregnancy had been about more than just producing an heir. It had been about maintaining the illusion of success, of keeping up appearances, while the foundation crumbled. And Lydia began to understand that Henry's command, his terrible violation of her and Nathan, might be only the most recent in a series of decisions driven by desperation and pride. She began to wonder what other secrets the Clayborne house held, what other cruelties had been committed to protect the family name. In the quarters, whispers spread. Nathan had been moved to the far fields, given the hardest work, isolated from everyone he knew. The message was clear. He had been used and discarded, marked in some way that others recognized even without knowing details. Some of the older enslaved people remembered similar situations on other plantations, remembered children born to white wives whose features told stories no one dared speak aloud. The community closed around Nathan as best they could, but the damage was done. He worked without speaking, ate without tasting, existed without living. The thing that had been taken from him was not just his body or his choice. It was his ability to believe he had any control over any aspect of his existence. He was a tool, nothing more, used and put away when no longer needed. But Nathan was also watching. He noticed when the overseer started selling equipment privately, pocketing the money before it reached Henry's accounts. He noticed when the master started making trips to Jackson and returning in darker mood. He noticed debts being called in, notices arriving by mail, tense conversations between Henry and other plantation owners who visited on business. Nathan said nothing. He simply observed, filed the information away, and waited. Because if the Clayborne empire was crumbling, if Henry's desperation was only going to grow, then eventually there would be a moment when the careful structure of control slipped, and in that moment people who had been watching and waiting might find opportunities for actions that had previously been impossible. As winter approached, as Lydia's pregnancy became visible and Henry's public image seemed to improve, the true situation beneath the surface grew more complex and more dangerous. 3 people bound together by an act of violence. 3 people carrying secrets that could destroy everything. 3 people beginning to understand that the conclusion to this story was far from written. The master's command had been obeyed, but the consequences of that obedience had only just begun to unfold. January brought ice storms that coated the Mississippi landscape in glass. The cotton fields lay dormant, brown stalks poking through frozen mud. Inside Clayborne House, fires burned constantly, and Lydia wore heavy shawls over her expanding body. She was 5 months pregnant, clearly showing, and the local families who visited remarked on how well she looked, how motherhood agreed with her. She smiled and accepted their compliments, and said nothing about the nightmares that woke her every evening. Nothing about how she could not look at herself in mirrors without feeling sick. Nothing about how the child moving inside her felt like evidence of a crime she had been forced to participate in. Henry was pleased. The pregnancy had achieved its purpose socially. The whispers about the Clayborne line had stopped, replaced by congratulations and speculations about whether the child would be a boy, but his satisfaction was surface level. Underneath, the financial pressures were intensifying in ways he could no longer hide entirely. On January 15th, a man named Thomas Brookshire arrived from Jackson. He was a banker, impeccably dressed, carrying a leather case that he set on Henry's desk with careful precision. They spoke behind closed doors for 3 hours. When Brookshire left, Henry sat alone in his study until midnight, a bottle of whiskey open beside him. Lydia watched from the hallway, hidden in shadows. She had become skilled at invisibility, and moving through the house unnoticed, at gathering information from servants and correspondents, and the tones of Henry's voice when he spoke to visitors. She knew the plantation was in debt. She knew Henry had borrowed extensively to maintain appearances after several poor harvest years. She knew the baby she carried was not just an heir, but a shield against questions about Henry's fitness to lead the family business. But she did not yet know how deep the problems ran, or how closely Henry's desperation was tied to decisions made long before she entered the family. The truth began to emerge through a series of small discoveries. First, Lydia found a letter in Henry's coat pocket while the servants were cleaning, a letter from a cotton broker in New Orleans demanding payment for goods Henry had purchased on credit but never paid for. The amount was staggering, enough to buy a small farm. Then she overheard a conversation between Henry and the plantation's lead overseer, a brutal man named Talbert, who ran the enslaved workers with systematic cruelty. Talbert was pushing Henry to sell people to thin out the labor force and generate quick cash. Henry was resisting, but his resistance sounded weak, as if he knew this option would eventually be necessary. Most damning was what she found in the attic in late January. She had gone up looking for baby items stored after Henry's mother died, thinking she might prepare a proper nursery. Instead, she found boxes of correspondence dating back 20 years, letters between Henry's father, Thomas, and various business associates, legal documents, records of transactions that made Lydia's blood run cold. Thomas Clayborne had been worse than Henry. The letters revealed a pattern of violence, fraud, and exploitation that went beyond even the normalized horrors of plantation slavery. Thomas had traded in enslaved people as a side business, buying and selling humans like commodities, separating families for profit. He had doored records to hide the deaths of people who had been worked to death. He had participated in the illegal international slave trade as late as 1855, smuggling people in from Caribbean ports years after such trade was supposedly ended, and Henry had known. There were letters from him to his father written when Henry was in his 20s, discussing strategies for avoiding law enforcement, for covering tracks, for ensuring no evidence led back to the Clayborne name. Henry had not just inherited his father's business, he had been an active participant in its darkest aspects. Lydia sat in the attic dust with these letters spread around her, understanding finally why Henry had been so desperate for an heir, why the idea of the Clayborne name dying was intolerable to him. It was not just pride, it was guilt. He needed a son to validate everything, to prove that the Clayborne legacy could continue despite the evil it was built upon. Without an heir, the family name would end with him, and all the suffering his family had caused would have no justification, no continuation, no way to be reframed as necessary building blocks for something greater. She was carrying the child meant to absolve him. The baby in her womb was not just an heir. It was Henry's attempt to outrun his father's sins and his own. The realization hardened something in Lydia. She had spent months thinking of herself as a victim, as someone whose life had been destroyed by circumstances beyond her control. But these letters showed her that her suffering was part of a much larger pattern, that Henry had been destroying lives with systematic efficiency for decades, that Nathan was one of hundreds who had been used and discarded to build the Clayborne fortune. She could not change the past, but she could affect the future. The question was how. In the quarters, Nathan's isolation was absolute. The other enslaved people tried to include him to draw him back into community, but he had retreated so far inside himself that connection felt impossible. He worked, ate, slept, and avoided thinking about anything beyond immediate survival. But in late February, something changed. A new overseer was hired to replace one who had been fired for stealing. The new man was younger, less brutal, someone who had worked previously on plantations where enslaved people were treated as expensive investments to be maintained rather than disposable resources to be consumed. He noticed Nathan's skills, noticed how work quality improved when Nathan was allowed to use his carpentry and metalwork abilities. He reassigned Nathan to repair projects around the plantation. It was not mercy. It was practical efficiency, but it removed Nathan from the worst of the field labor and put him in situations where he had slightly more autonomy, slightly more ability to move around the property. This mobility gave Nathan access to information. He overheard conversations between overseers about financial troubles. He saw creditors arriving and leaving with angry expressions. He noticed items disappearing from storage buildings sold off quietly to raise cash, and he began to understand that the plantation was failing, that Henry's power was not as absolute as it appeared, that the whole structure was more fragile than anyone realized. He also saw Lydia, now obviously pregnant, moving through the house and grounds with a purposefulness that had not been there before. Once their eyes met across the yard, the first time they had looked directly at each other since the last night in the cabin. Neither spoke, but something passed between them, a recognition of shared knowledge, shared pain, and perhaps shared interest in seeing Henry's control disrupted. March brought the beginning of planting season, and with it increased pressure on everyone. The enslaved workers were driven harder. The overseers were more aggressive, and Henry spent long days in the fields desperately trying to ensure a successful crop that might save him from financial collapse. On March 18th, something broke. Tolbert, the lead overseer, beat a young man named Samuel for allegedly moving too slowly while plowing. The beating went on too long, was too severe, and when it ended, Samuel could not stand. He was carried to the quarters and died 3 hours later from internal injuries. The community was devastated. Samuel had been 19 years old, well-liked, someone's son and brother and friend. His death was not unusual. Enslaved people died regularly from overwork, disease, and violence, but something about the casual brutality of it, the absolute unnecessary waste, pushed people past the point of silent endurance. Nathan was in the carpentry shed when he heard about Samuel's death. He stood there with a hammer in his hand, staring at nothing, and felt something shift inside him. The careful walls he had built to protect himself, the strategies of psychological survival that had allowed him to continue existing, they crumbled. He had watched too many people die, had endured too many violations, had seen too much proof that their lives meant nothing to the people who owned them. That night, people gathered quietly in the quarters. They spoke in whispers about what had happened, about how no one would be punished, about how Samuel's mother was being forced back to work the next morning despite her grief, and they spoke about other things, about how the plantation was failing financially, about how the master's power was weakening, about how the system that enslaved them was not as invincible as it pretended to be. Nathan did not say much, but people noticed him listening, noticed the way his silence had changed from despairing to calculating. Something was different about him, something that made people nervous and hopeful in equal measure. In the house, Lydia learned about Samuel's death from the house servants who spoke of it in hushed tones while preparing dinner. She felt the news like a physical blow. Another life destroyed to maintain Henry's operation, another person consumed by the machine of slavery, and this time she could not remain passive, could not tell herself there was nothing she could do. She waited until Henry returned from the fields that evening, exhausted and frustrated with how the planting was progressing. When he entered his study, she followed him inside and closed the door. "Samuel is dead," she said without preamble. Henry looked up from pouring whiskey, his expression annoyed. "Who? The young man Talbot beat this afternoon. He died. That is unfortunate," Henry said flatly. "Talbot will need to be more careful. We cannot afford to lose workers right now. Is that all you have to say?" Lydia's voice was tight with controlled rage. "A person was beaten to death on your property, and your only concern is losing a worker." "He was not a person, Lydia," Henry said with the exaggerated patience of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "He was property. Valuable property that was damaged through carelessness. Yes, but let us not be dramatic about it." "Dramatic." Lydia took a step forward. "You commanded me to conceive a child through rape, and now you speak of other human beings as if they were broken equipment. What has happened to you, Henry? What kind of monster are you?" The words were out before she could stop them. She saw Henry's expression change, saw rage flash across his face. He set down the whiskey glass very carefully, very slowly. "You will never speak to me that way again," he said quietly. "Do you understand me? I am your husband. This is my house. Everything in it, including you, exists by my allowance. You will remember your place." "My place?" Lydia laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "I know exactly what my place is, Henry. I am the woman you forced to commit adultery so you could pretend to the world that you are capable of fathering children. I am carrying evidence of your inadequacy and your cruelty. Do not speak to me about knowing my place." Henry moved faster than she expected. He grabbed her by the throat, not choking, but holding her immobile, his face inches from hers. "You will watch your tongue, or I will make you regret every word. Pregnancy will not protect you from consequences, Lydia. Remember what I said about your family. Remember what I can do." He released her, and she stumbled backward, her hand going to her neck where his fingers had left red marks. They stared at each other across the study, all pretense of civility gone. The truth of their relationship laid bare. "Get out," Henry said coldly. "Go to your room and stay there. I will send word when I wish to see you again." Lydia left, her body shaking, her mind clearer than it had been in months. The confrontation had stripped away her last illusions. Henry was not just cruel, he was dangerous, and as long as she remained in this house under his control, she was at risk. The baby was at risk. Everyone was at risk. She needed help. She needed allies. And there was only one person on this plantation who might understand what she was facing, who might share her interest in seeing Henry's power broken. That night, after the house had gone quiet, Lydia did something she had never done before. She left through the kitchen door and walked toward the quarters, her cloak pulled tight against the cold. She had no clear plan, only a desperate need to take some action, to stop being passive, to find a way forward that did not end with her and her child trapped forever under Henry's control. She found Nathan in the carpentry shed working by lantern light on repairs he had not finished during the day. He looked up when she entered, his expression wary, frightened even. Her presence here was dangerous for both of them. If they were discovered, if anyone saw them together, Henry would assume the worst, and the consequences would be catastrophic. "I need to speak with you," Lydia said quietly. "I know this is dangerous. I know you have every reason to refuse, but please, I need help, and I think you need help too. We cannot continue living like this." Nathan stared at her, this white woman who had been forced into his life in the most violent way possible, who now stood in his workspace asking for help as if they were equals, as if the gulf between their positions could be bridged by shared suffering. He should have sent her away, should have protected himself by refusing any connection to her. But he thought of Samuel lying dead in the quarters. He thought of the secrets he had learned about the plantation's failing finances. He thought of how Henry's desperation was only going to increase, how the situation would only get worse, how more people would suffer unless something changed. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "I want to understand what is really happening here," Lydia said. "I want to know about the finances, about the debts, about what my husband is hiding. I have found some things, letters, documents, but I do not understand all of it. You have been watching. You notice things. I need to know what you know. Why?" Nathan's voice was flat. "What difference will it make? You cannot stop him. Neither can I." "Maybe not," Lydia admitted, "but I am tired of being helpless. I am tired of watching people suffer while I do nothing. I have evidence of illegal activities, things Henry's father did, things Henry helped with. If that evidence reached the right people and the right questions were asked, it might cause problems for him. It might create leverage we could use. You want to blackmail your own husband?" Nathan asked, something almost like surprise breaking through his careful control. "I want to survive," Lydia said simply, "and I want my child to have a chance at a life that is not built on this foundation of suffering. If that requires using Henry's secrets against him, then yes, I will do it. But I cannot do it alone." They stood in silence, two people who should never have been forced into each other's lives, now bound together by violence and necessity, trying to decide if trust was possible when everything in their world told them it was not. "If we are caught," Nathan said slowly, "I will be killed. You understand that?" "I understand," Lydia said, "and I am sorry. I am sorry for everything that has happened, for what I participated in even though I had no choice, for every pain this family has caused you and everyone else here. If you want me to leave, I will. But if you are willing to help me understand what is happening, to work together to find a way to change our situation, then I promise you I will do everything in my power to protect you." Nathan laughed a bitter sound. "You have no power. Not yet," Lydia agreed. "But Henry is failing. I can see it." "You can see it. When powerful men fail, they become vulnerable. And when they are vulnerable, sometimes they can be stopped. I do not know if we can actually do anything, but I know I have to try." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, a decision made that he could not take back. A risk accepted because the alternative, continuing to exist in this nightmare without even attempting resistance, had become intolerable. "There are things happening," he said quietly, "things the master does not know about yet. People are planning, nothing organized, nothing certain, but the possibility is there. If you want to help, if you are serious about using what you know, then maybe together we can create an opportunity." "Tell me," Lydia said, and there, in the lamplight of a plantation carpenter's shed, surrounded by tools made to build and repair the machinery of slavery, two people who have been systematically dehumanized by the system began planning how to break it. Spring moved towards summer, and the cotton grew in rows that stretched toward the horizon. Henry drove everyone harder, desperate for a successful harvest that would ease his financial pressures. The overseers pushed the enslaved workers past exhaustion. People began collapsing in the fields from heat and overwork. Another person died, an older woman named Margaret, who simply stopped breathing while picking cotton, her heart giving out after 53 years of exploitation. In the house, Lydia was 7 months pregnant, confined largely to her rooms by both custom and Henry's orders. He wanted her visible enough that the community saw the pregnancy progressing, but isolated enough that she could not interfere with his business. She spent her days reading, sewing, and secretly compiling information about the Clayborne family's activities. Her meetings with Nathan had continued, always brief, always dangerous, always in locations where they were unlikely to be discovered. He brought her information from the quarters, details about the plantation's operations, about which overseers were stealing, about how debts were being managed, about the growing desperation among the enslaved community as conditions worsened. She shared what she had found in Thomas Clayborne's correspondence. The evidence of illegal slave trading, the documentation of fraud, the letters that prove systematic criminality stretching back decades. Together they began to piece together a picture of just how vulnerable Henry actually was. The Clayborne finances were catastrophic. Henry owed money to banks in 3 states. He had borrowed against future cotton crops that were not yet planted. He had sold equipment and land parcels secretly to generate cash, but had not informed his creditors. If any of these financial manipulations were exposed, Henry could be ruined, stripped of property, possibly imprisoned for fraud, certainly destroyed socially. But Lydia and Nathan were not the only people gathering information. In late May, a letter arrived from a law firm in New Orleans. Henry received it during breakfast and went pale while reading. He excused himself abruptly and spent the rest of the day behind locked doors in his study, emerging only after dark with red eyes and the smell of whiskey heavy on his breath. Lydia managed to see the letter later. Henry had left it on his desk in his drunkenness. It was from creditors who had purchased some of Thomas Clayborne's old debts and were now demanding immediate payment. If Henry could not pay within 60 days, they would seize the plantation through legal action. The amount they demanded was enormous, far more than Henry could raise, even if he sold every enslaved person on the property. Henry was trapped. His desperation had led him to make increasingly reckless decisions. And now those decisions were converging into a crisis he could not escape. Lydia understood that this made him more dangerous than ever. Desperate men committed desperate acts, and everyone around Henry was at risk when his back was against the wall. On June 2nd, Henry made his next move. He called Talbot and the other overseers to a meeting and gave orders that shocked even men accustomed to brutality. He was going to sell 40 enslaved people immediately, break up families if necessary, whatever it took to generate enough cash to satisfy the creditors temporarily. He would sort out long-term problems later, but for now, he needed to buy time. The news spread through the quarters like wildfire. People who had lived on the Clayborne plantation their entire lives were going to be sold away, separated from families, sent to parts unknown where conditions might be even worse. Parents would lose children. Spouses would be torn apart. The fragile community that had sustained people through years of horror was about to be shattered. Nathan brought the news to Lydia the night he learned it. They met in the attic of the main house. A risk, but everywhere was a risk now, and they needed to make decisions quickly. "We are out of time," Nathan said bluntly. "He is selling people in 1 week. If we are going to do anything, it has to be now." "I can send letters," Lydia said. She had written several versions over the past weeks. Letters addressed to lawyers, newspapers, government officials detailing Thomas Clayborne's illegal activities and Henry's complicity. If they reach the right people, if questions are asked, it might create enough scandal to prevent the sale to tie Henry up in legal problems. "It might," Nathan agreed, "or it might just make him more desperate, more dangerous. He could kill us both for interfering, could kill anyone he suspects of betrayal." "What choice do we have?" Lydia asked. "We can sit here and let him destroy more lives, or we can take the chance that exposing him might create change. I know the risk. I know we might fail, but I cannot do nothing any more." Nathan nodded slowly. "There are people in the quarters who want to run, who have been planning escape routes for years but never had the opportunity because the security was too tight. If Henry is distracted by legal troubles, if the overseers are confused and the system is disrupted, some people might have a chance to reach free territory. "Are you thinking of running?" Lydia asked. "I do not know," Nathan admitted. "Where would I go? How would I survive? But yes, if there is a chance, I have to take it. I cannot stay here knowing what this place has taken from me." They looked at each other. Two people bound together by violence, by necessity, by shared determination to resist the man who had tried to break them both. The connection between them was not friendship exactly. The gulf between their experiences was too wide. The original sin that had forced them together, too terrible. But it was understanding. It was recognition of shared humanity in a system designed to destroy that humanity. Then we move forward. Lydia said, "I will send the letters tomorrow. You prepare whatever plans need to be prepared, and we hope that creating chaos in Henry's world will be enough to save at least some of the people he is trying to destroy." The next day, Lydia composed her final versions of the letters. She was careful, methodical, including just enough verifiable detail to make investigations likely, but not so much that Henry could immediately identify how the information had leaked. She addressed envelopes to a lawyer in Jackson known for taking controversial cases, to a newspaper editor in New Orleans with abolitionist sympathies, to a federal marshal who investigated fraud. Getting them mailed was the challenge. She could not simply hand them to the house servants. That would be too obvious, too traceable. Instead, she waited until Henry left for the fields, then told the staff she was going to rest in her room. She climbed out a window, dropped the letters over the garden wall where Nathan had arranged for someone from the quarters to pick them up, then climbed back inside before anyone noticed her absence. It was reckless, dangerous, and might accomplish nothing, but it was action. It was resistance. It was refusal to be passive while evil proceeded unchecked. 4 days later, the responses began arriving. A marshal came to the plantation asking questions about Thomas Clayborne's business practices. The lawyer from Jackson sent a formal inquiry demanding to see certain financial records. The newspaper published a small article raising questions about the Clayborne family's activities during the 1840s and 1850s. Henry went from stressed to frantic. He called emergency meetings with his lawyer, with business associates, with anyone who might help him contain the situation. He accused the overseers of leaking information, fired 2 of them, threatened everyone else. He became paranoid, seeing betrayal everywhere, trusting no one. The plantation descended into chaos. Without consistent overseer supervision, work slowed. People in the quarters sensed the weakness, sensed opportunity. Whispers of escape grew louder. Plans that had been theoretical became concrete. On June 10th, the scheduled date for the sale of enslaved people came and went. Henry could not proceed because the marshal had frozen his assets pending investigation of the fraud allegations. He was trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare of his own making, unable to raise the money he needed, unable to take the actions he had planned. In the house, Lydia remained confined to her rooms, officially due to pregnancy complications. In reality, Henry had ordered her isolated because he suspected she knew something about the letters, though he had no proof. She spent her days reading, waiting, and hoping that the chaos she had helped create would be enough. On June 14th, Nathan disappeared. He did not show up for morning work assignments. His sleeping space in the quarters was empty. An immediate search was organized, but Nathan had a full night's head start and had planned carefully. He had tools, some food stolen over weeks, and most importantly, knowledge of the terrain from years of working in every corner of the plantation. The search lasted 3 days and found nothing. Henry was livid, convinced this was connected to everything else, but unable to prove anything. He increased security, locked down the plantation, but the damage was done. Nathan's successful escape gave others hope. It showed that the system was not impenetrable. 2 weeks later, 3 more people disappeared. Then 2 more. The hemorrhaging of enslaved labor only worsened Henry's financial situation. His creditors grew more aggressive. The legal investigations expanded. The newspaper articles became longer and more detailed. And in late June, the most damaging revelation emerged. A lawyer working through Thomas Clayborne's old papers found evidence that connected the illegal slave trading not just to Thomas, but to other prominent Mississippi families. The scandal expanded beyond the Claybornes. Suddenly powerful men who might have protected Henry for the sake of solidarity were too busy protecting themselves. Henry's social standing collapsed. Invitations stopped coming. Business associates refused to meet with him. The carefully maintained facade of respectability that had been everything to him simply dissolved, destroyed by the exposure of truths that had been hidden for decades. On July 3rd, Lydia went into labor 6 weeks early. The stress, the fear, the physical toll of everything that had happened finally caught up with her body. The baby came fast and hard, and the doctor had barely arrived when the child emerged. A boy, small but healthy, crying with surprising strength. Henry held his son for exactly 43 seconds, just long enough to verify the child was male. Then he handed the baby back to the midwife and walked out of the room. He did not return that day or the next. When Lydia finally saw him 3 days later, he looked like he had aged 10 years. His face was drawn, his eyes hollow, his movements slow. "They are going to take everything," he said quietly. "The plantation, the house, all of it. The marshal has filed criminal charges for fraud. The creditors have won their legal case. We have 60 days before we are evicted from our own home." Lydia said nothing. She held her son, Henry's son by law, Nathan's son by blood, her son by suffering, and felt no triumph, no vindication, only exhaustion and a grim understanding that justice, such as it was, came with costs that everyone paid. "Was it you?" Henry asked. "Did you send those letters?" Lydia looked at her husband, this man who had orchestrated such cruelty, who was now facing the consequences of his family's sins. "Does it matter? Answer me," Henry demanded. But there was no force in his voice anymore. He was broken, defeated, and they both knew it. "Yes," Lydia said quietly. "I sent the letters. I exposed what your father did, what you helped him do, what you continued doing. I could not stop you through direct confrontation, so I used the truth against you, and I would do it again." Henry stared at her, and for a moment she thought he might attack her, might try one last desperate act of violence, but instead he laughed, a sound without humor, the laugh of a man watching his world burn. "You have destroyed me," he said. "You destroyed yourself," Lydia replied. "I simply made sure people knew about it." Henry left the room and did not return. Over the next weeks, as the baby grew stronger and Lydia recovered from childbirth, Henry dismantled what remained of his life. He sold personal items to pay immediate debts. He made futile attempts to negotiate with creditors. He drank heavily and slept little and watched everything he had inherited slip away. On August 12th, Henry Clayborne walked into the barn, closed the door behind him, and hanged himself from the rafters. A worker found him the next morning, his body turning slowly in the August heat. The news shocked no one who knew the situation. Ruined men often chose this exit. The only surprise was that Henry had waited as long as he did. Lydia buried her husband next to his father in the family plot. 17 people attended the funeral, a fraction of what would have come a year earlier. The minister spoke briefly about mercy and judgment. No one mentioned legacy. There was no legacy to celebrate. 3 days after the funeral, Lydia received visitors, the lawyer from Jackson, who had pursued the investigations, accompanied by a federal marshal. They sat in Henry's old study, surrounded by boxes of documents being cataloged as evidence. "Mrs. Clayborne," the lawyer began carefully, "we have completed our investigation of your late husband's activities and those of his father. The evidence you provided was instrumental in uncovering significant criminal wrongdoing." Lydia said nothing. She sat with her son in her arms, waiting. "The plantation and all associated properties will be sold to satisfy creditors," the lawyer continued. "You will have 30 days to vacate. However, there may be a small amount of money remaining after debts are paid, enough perhaps to establish yourself elsewhere to begin again." "And the people who are enslaved here?" Lydia asked. "What happens to them?" The marshal and lawyer exchanged glances. "They will be sold with the property as is customary." "No," Lydia said firmly. "Find another way. The evidence I provided implicated not just the Claybornes, but multiple families involved in illegal slave trading. Use that information to create leverage. Free these people as part of whatever legal settlement is reached. That is not how these proceedings typically work." The lawyer said, "Make it work," Lydia insisted. "I have more evidence I did not include in my original letters. Evidence that could expand your investigation significantly. You want it. You negotiate freedom for the people on this plantation. All of them." The lawyer studied her face, saw the absolute determination there, and nodded slowly. I will see what can be done. No promises, but I will try. It took 6 weeks of negotiations, but eventually a deal was reached. The people enslaved on the Clayborne plantation would be freed as part of a federal settlement related to the slave trading investigations. It was not restitution. Nothing could undo the suffering they had endured, but it was freedom, legal and documented, a chance to begin lives not owned by others. Lydia left Mississippi in late September with her son and enough money to rent a small house in Philadelphia. She changed her name, invented a story about being a widow from Alabama, and worked as a seamstress to support herself and the child. She never remarried. She never returned to the South. She told her son the truth when he was old enough to understand, told him about Henry, about Nathan, about the circumstances of his birth. She did not hide the horror of it, but she also did not let the horror define him. He was his own person, she told him, responsible for his own choices, free to build whatever life he wished. Nathan's fate remained unknown. Lydia made inquiries over the years through abolitionist networks, but no one could confirm what had happened to him after he escaped. Some said he made it to Canada. Others said he was caught and killed during the escape. Still others claimed he had joined communities of formerly enslaved people trying to build new lives in the North. Lydia chose to believe he had survived, had found some measure of peace after everything that had been taken from him. She had no way to know if this was true, but she needed to believe it, needed to think that at least one person who had been caught in the Clayborne destruction had found a way forward. The Clayborne plantation was divided and sold to multiple buyers. The house fell into disrepair and was eventually torn down. By 1870, nothing remained of the Clayborne legacy except records and legal archives and memories held by people who had survived its cruelties. The story should end here with justice served and evil punished. But history is not that neat. Many of the families implicated in the investigations faced no serious consequences. The systems that had enabled the Claybornes continued in different forms, and for every enslaved person freed by legal settlements, thousands more remained trapped in bondage until the Civil War finally broke the institution 3 years later. But in one small way, on one small plantation in Mississippi, the machinery of slavery was disrupted. People were freed. Secrets were exposed. A man who thought his power was absolute learned that power has limits, and a woman who had been treated as property, forced to participate in horrors not of her choosing, found a way to resist, to fight back, to use the system's own corruption against itself and create a crack in the foundation wide enough for some people to escape through. That mattered. It did not erase the suffering. It did not make anything right. But it mattered. Philadelphia, 1875. Lydia sat by the window of her small apartment watching her son play in the street below with other neighborhood children. He was 16 years old, tall and strong, with features that raised occasional questions from people who noticed details, but mostly went unremarked. He was simply William Carter, the son of a widow, a young man with a future ahead of him that he would build with his own hands. The letter had arrived that morning from an abolitionist organization Lydia still maintained contact with. It was brief, just a few lines, but it had taken her breath away when she read it. Regarding your inquiry about Nathan Moss, we have confirmed he reached Toronto in the fall of 1858. He established himself as a carpenter and blacksmith. He married in 1861 and has 2 children. He does not wish to resume contact with anyone from his past life, which we hope you understand. But he asks that if we ever located you, we tell you he survived, that he is free, that he wishes you peace. Lydia folded the letter fully and placed it in a small box where she kept important documents. Nathan had survived, had built a life, had found something that could maybe eventually be called happiness, despite everything that had been taken from him. She looked at her son again, this young man who existed because of violence, but who had been raised with love, who knew his history but was not defined by it, who had opportunities his biological father never could have dreamed of. The weight of the past never fully lifted. Lydia still woke sometimes from nightmares about the cabin, about Henry's cold voice giving his command, about the moment when her life split into before and after. She still carried guilt about her participation, however, forced in systems of oppression. She still wondered if she could have done more, acted sooner, saved more people, but she had done something. When the moment came when the choice was between continued complicity and dangerous resistance, she had chosen resistance. It had not been heroic. She had been terrified every step of the way, had acted out of desperation as much as principle. But she had acted, and because she acted, because Nathan acted, because people in the quarters acted when opportunities emerged, some lives were saved, some people escaped, some measure of justice was achieved. It was not enough, it would never be enough, but it was something. That evening, William came home with a book he had been allowed to borrow from a neighbor, a history of ancient Rome, which he had become fascinated with lately. He sat at the table studying it while Lydia prepared supper, and she watched him absorbed in learning in the life of the mind that had been systematically denied to so many. "Mother," he said without looking up, "do you ever regret the choices you made, leaving Mississippi, exposing the Claybornes, all of it?" It was not the first time he had asked variations of this question. He was old enough now to understand the complexity, the moral ambiguity, the impossible choices his mother had faced. Every day, Lydia answered honestly, "I regret that those choices were necessary. I regret the system that created the situations where such choices had to be made. But do I regret acting rather than remaining silent? No, never." William nodded, satisfied with this answer as he always was when she told him the truth rather than offering comfortable lies. Outside, Philadelphia went about its evening routines. Somewhere far to the north in another country, a man who had once been enslaved worked in his carpentry shop and tried not to think too much about the past. Somewhere in the south, the plantation that had been called Clayborne House was cotton fields again, worked by different people under different arrangements, the house itself erased as if it had never existed. And in a small apartment above a tailor's shop, a woman who had survived horrors and fought back in the only ways available to her, sat with her son and allowed herself just for a moment to feel something that might have been peace. The story of the Clayborne plantation was not unique. It was replicated across the South in countless variations, wherever slavery existed, wherever power was concentrated and human beings were treated as property. Most of these stories were never recorded, never remembered, lost to time, and the deliberate eraser of uncomfortable truths. But some stories survive, some testimonies endure, and sometimes when we listen carefully to the fragments that remain, we can piece together understanding of how systems of oppression work, how resistance emerges, how ordinary people trapped in extraordinary evil find ways to maintain dignity and humanity, and sometimes rarely to fight back. This was one such story, not exceptional, not particularly heroic, but human, showing how people navigate impossible situations, how they make choices with no good options, how they survive and sometimes create small spaces of freedom even within structures designed to crush them. The Clayborne plantation is gone. Henry is long dead, but the questions his story raises remain relevant. What do we do when we realize we are complicit in systems of oppression? How do we resist when resistance seems impossible? What are we willing to risk to do what is right? How do we live with the consequences of terrible choices made in terrible circumstances? These questions have no easy answers, but they are questions worth asking, worth wrestling with, worth carrying forward as we confront the legacies of historical injustice and work to build systems that honor human dignity rather than destroying it. The story ends here. But the work of understanding and confronting these truths continues generation after generation until the day when such stories become not just historical records but impossible to imagine in present reality. T.